Alright everybody, the stream should be knocking right about now. If I missed you on attendance, feel free to bug me in a little bit. Okay, so today, let's make sure the stream is up and working. The stream looks good. Fantastic. So we are live. I'll give it a couple seconds for everybody to jump over. Okay. We will wait for this. All right. The stream is live, and I'm going to get started. Okay. We'll see how long it takes for everybody to get here. I will refresh my stream just to make sure we are broadcasting. So today we're doing Theravada Mahayana Buddhism and Buddhology mostly, with a little bit on mysticism. And let's see if you're having any problems. That's part of life. Twitch now. Alright, I'm gonna double check this is working, make sure people can see it. We've got everybody. Fantastic. Alright, so welcome everybody. I see we have 50 people. So we're gonna jump on in. So we did metaphysical concepts last class. And I'll answer questions verbally at the end of every slide, or if I notice them as I'm chatting. Feel free to type them in your Discord or on the live stream. Either one is fine with me. I'll answer both, to be fair. So I just gotta, where is my sidebar? There's my chat bar, okay. I don't want to collapse it. There we go, it's back. Alright, so let's get started everybody. Here we go. Okay. So we did metaphysics last time. Now this is just for people who missed it, or if you're a random Twitch person and you really want to know more about Buddhist metaphysics, here's the big ones we did. So we did this last time. So here we go. So we did the, right, impermanence, no self, karma, sense, karma, nirvana, dharma, and the nature of the Buddha. And this is where we stopped. Now, I know it was a week ago, so you may have forgotten. All of this is in Morgan. Let me find my page. Notes here. Yep. So this is literally in the chapter called Buddhist Metaphysical Concepts. So if you missed any of this, it's all in there. It's pretty good. Probably the only part I don't really like is the nature of the Buddha one, but we're going to get into an alternative Buddhology today, so that should be fine. Also, a quick note for the students here. These streams will be up for at least 2 weeks on Twitch. I'm not a partner or anything, so they go away. But eventually, I'll probably upload them unlisted to YouTube as well, or maybe even list them. So, okay, let us get into the meat of today, the new stuff. So this is not from Morgan, just a note. This is from a book called The History of Zen Buddhism by Heinrich Domurian. He's a Jesuit, actually. But he wrote a great book, so we're going to reference it. So he has kind of the core unity. Before we get into the disunity, what brings Buddhism together? Well, mysticism is his answer of what it all has in common. And then he points out here, some people call Buddhism not a religion for some strange reason. Now, to quote Domurian, he says, "Today Buddhism is generally recognized by scholars as a religion, and because of its historical and contemporary significance, it ranks among the world's great religions. The basic trait of Buddhism is its striving for otherworldly salvation." So inevitably, right, it is looking for a salvific goal. So it is religion. It has philosophical elements like all religions. And he even mentions there's actually a controversy about this, but we're not going to worry about that today. Now, the core unity of all kinds of Buddhism, and we'll get into the two major branches today, is mysticism. So, and he wants to point out that in English, right, our idea of mysticism started in a different way, right? So he says, since the definition of mysticism is developed within Christianity, which calls for the immediate experience of a personal God through the knowing and loving soul, does not apply to many unmistakably mystical phenomena in the non-Christian religions. It has become necessary to place alongside the supernatural mysticism of grace the concept of natural mysticism. And natural mysticism is basically the term he uses for Buddhism, which I think is fair. Let me explain what he says here. And it says, for the moment we shall content ourselves with a general description and designate mysticism, here we go, as all efforts of man to elevate himself to a supercosmic, supersensory sphere which he experiences immediately. And I have that quote here for you all, so you can reference it. So this is the basic definition of what this is. Now, he points out here, the supercosmic domain stands in a necessary relationship with the absolute, with which man in mystical experiences establishes some kind of contact, where these three essential elements are manifest, namely, where man transcends the sense realm, breaks through the limits of normal psychic experience, and reaches the absolute, with a capital A. Then here we can speak of mysticism. The respective strength of each of these three elements varies greatly from case to case, but none can be missing entirely. And then he makes a point here too, that clearly this is separated from sorcery, magic, and even metaphysics. This is his quote. He says, it's clear definition from these phenomenon. So since contact with the absolute becomes, in a mystical experience, a means for salvation, Buddhism, precisely because it is mystical in element, must be regarded as religion. And Buddha and those who followed him saw mystical enlightenment as the vehicle of salvation that carried them beyond this world to the quote-unquote other shore. So this is a great point to start before we get into the divisions, right? All the sects, the two major sects of Buddhism. It's good to remember that there is this natural unity that they all agree on, which isn't just the metaphysics and the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path we talked about last time, but also this core unity of mysticism that brings them together. And this is officially the end of a slide. So if you have any questions, you can type it in the chat, or you can type it in the Discord for 190, and I'll be happy to answer. I'll give you guys about, I think we have a 4 to 5 second stream delay, so I'll give y'all a little bit to ask questions. If you don't have any, I'll move on. So, and those random flashes in my background, I apologize for that. That is a problem. Yep. Okay, it's a question not related to the slide. You can type it. I might not answer it though. It depends if I might answer at the end of class, but that's the nice thing with text, is I can always come back to it. Totally ask it if it's unrelated to the slide. There's never a bad time to ask. I just might choose not to answer. Okay, somebody asked a great question, which I will answer after the PowerPoint today. We should have about 15 minutes at the end of class. I will answer this question. How are we going to go to do tests? That's a great question. So literally last week, they hypothetically weren't going to cancel the whole semester. I had an answer. And now that they are going to cancel classes, I have a different answer, which I've actually decided. Short version, it'll be timed, typed tests, open book. But we'll talk about that after class. My mic is really close to your keyboard. Yes. More specifically, my gain is probably a little high. And it's probably too good of a mic. That's my two problems I run into right now. So, I'll work on the audio after today, if it seems to have too high of a background. Yeah, I accidentally bought a mic for something else, and now I have it for this, you know. Sometimes the mystical is real. Alright, if there's no more questions, let's keep going. So, first sect of Buddhism, and we were talking in class, I think it was 2 weeks ago, or last week, where my pictures tend to mostly be Japanese pictures because of my background. However, this is not a Japanese picture. Why? Here we're getting a little bit into the first sect of Buddhism, which is Theravada Buddhism. And this is a Theravada temple from Thailand, I think. Thai-style Theravada temple. So where do we see Theravada Buddhists? Well, generally speaking, they're in Sri Lanka. And for those who don't know, right, that's this island off southern India. And Southeast Asia, except for Vietnam, from what my informants tell me. Vietnam tends to be more Mahayana than Theravada. So, but Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar tends to be Theravada Buddhist. Okay, now, to quote Morgan, basically, right, this is what she would call the conservative form of Buddhism. Now, you might have a knee-jerk reaction to this, like, Professor, not that. Well, what do we mean by conservative? Conservative means, essentially, they follow the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, very exacting, and especially what we got to care about here is how do they discuss the way we get to salvation? So we talked about the mysticism as the unity, right? The unity in Buddhism is there is a salvation element. But the problem we run into is then what, right? How do we get to this? How does one do it? Well, for the Theravada Buddhists, like original Buddhists, they focus on how to salvation is the focus on monastic salvation. Now, again, what does monastic salvation mean practically? It means to be a good Theravada Buddhist, it has to be necessarily focused around the community. And they tend to be ethnically homogenous communities, so like it'll be like Cambodian or Thai, right? And then they'll have their Thai Buddhist temple, and the community supports the monks. So the way to be a salvific Buddhist in a Theravadan context is to be part of a community that supports a temple, and then by supporting the temple, you basically work you work on that, supporting them to get to enlightenment, and then you kind of also work on your karma for that next life. If you remember, this is a cyclical reincarnation religion, so necessarily in this is if you're not a monk, you basically can't make it. That's what we mean by conservative. We also mean to get from Morgan, if you don't have your Morgan with you, it's good to look back at Chapter 7. Theravadan Buddhists are the most in agreement with what we learned last class, like the basics of salvation, different rules for monks and laity. Really, only monks can make it to Nirvana, and I'm not going to lie to you folks, until 100 years ago, basically women could not make it in Theravada Buddhism. They were considered to be unclean, and that got changed recently, but still it was this idea of like, if you're a virtuous woman, what would you have to do? You basically have to reincarnate as a man who is then a monk, and then you get to enlightenment. And that was not seen as a problem. Now, next week we're actually reading from a Japanese book called Gyo, from the Tale of the Heike, and in that, it's actually a story of 4 women who managed to transcend, but they're not Theravadan. So that's a point I have to make here. So, I don't spend a whole lot of time capitulating what Theravada Buddhist is. The monastic salvation is important, and basically the 4 and 8 path is super important to understand, like what Theravada Buddhism does differently. Alright, any questions about Theravada Buddhism before we move on? Alright, let's see if there's any typed questions. No typed questions. Do we have any stream questions? Yeah, okay, somebody says 2 things. So, the first question I'll read is, so Theravada Buddhism is the original Buddhism? Yes. Mahayanans wouldn't like it, but that's the way you could think about it, right? Like, if there's like a Orthodox or Catholic, if we're comparing to Christianity, right? Theravada is like the Catholic or the Orthodox, right? They're doing it the same way you've generally been doing it for 2,500 years. And then the second question, can you reiterate the point on monastic salvation? Yes. Monastic salvation, strictly speaking, monks, that's what monastic means, people who join a monastery, right? So they're monks. Monks are the only ones that can really make it. So the focus of Theravada Buddhist communities is around the monasteries. So they, give alms and support the monks. And then the monks can reach enlightenment. And by helping monks reach enlightenment, you're kind of also improving yourself. So this is definitely the focus of Mahayana Buddhism, or Theravada, sorry. Now, the reason I mentioned the kind of how this is controversial, we'll get to it in a minute, but the other kinds of Buddhists actually call this kind of Buddhist the lesser vehicle, so there's a little bit of politics in here too. Alright. Great stream questions, thank you folks. Alright, let's go to the next slide. So, Mahayana Buddhism, okay. And this, Mahayanans actually call their kind of Buddhism the great vehicle. And they actually call Theravada Buddhism Hinayana, which means the lesser vehicle. So, kind of unlike Catholics and Protestants, both Buddhists think that the other kind of Buddhism gets you there. For the most part, in the last couple hundred years, there have been some strands of Mahayana Buddhism that don't think anybody except their strand will make it. But generally speaking, Mahayanas view Theravadans as, how can I say it, doing it too, but it's less efficient. And you'll see why in a minute, why they might think that. Alright, so, where is Mahayana Buddhism historically? Historically, it's Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam. These are the countries where this is the majority of their Buddhism. And until the Cultural Revolution, right, until the 1950s and 1960s, China would have been first in this list, right? They had the most Mahayana Buddhists. So right now you could say probably Japan has the most, but this is where you find it for the most part. And then what does it kind of add? Well, a couple things. First, it adds a metaphysical framework that traditional Buddhism was missing. So what I mean is traditional Buddhism was almost looked at more like a lifestyle choice and meditative practices and almost like an intellectual tradition, and it was missing like a lot of metaphysics and Buddhology and theology, and this gets added later by Mahayanans. And to be purely honest with you, where does Mahayana Buddhism really start? Well, when it hits China. So Buddhism hits China and then morphs with Taoism and Chinese practices, and then kind of explodes to the rest of Southeast and East Asia, which it is numerically, there is a lot of Mahayanas too. All right. So, getting into this, the goal of salvation, the goal now switches to, so before, remember I emphasized monastic salvation. Again, important. Now, Mahayans still have monks, and they still think monastic way is the best way to go. However, the goal switches from just monks finding salvation to the goal is now the salvation of all sentient creatures. Now, when I say sentient, we mean that have a consciousness, so it means humans, right? But now, all of a sudden, there's this interest where we can save everybody, this time, not just monks. So you're not just saving like a hypothetical you in the future, right? Like, okay, in 5 lives, you'll reincarnate as a monk, and then now you can finally make it. And again, I'm going to quote from Do Murin. He has a bunch of great quotes here. Let me see. 22, 23. So he talks about the ways that there are to get there. Oh, do I want to have this here? Let's see. So this is before I read my quote. I had a great quote, but so basically, how do they get there? Like, why should every creature be saved? And if we remember last time we talked about the metaphysics, Buddhists basically didn't think we have souls, but they kind of get around that in Mahayana Buddhism by saying basically everything has a Buddha nature, especially all sentient things have a Buddha nature. Then this Buddha nature, there's a Buddha nature to all things, which binds them all together, basically. And then this leads straight into something called the Bodhisattva ideal. And what is a Bodhisattva? I'll start explaining it. Well, so as religious salvation of all sentient being, Buddhism possesses an appropriate vehicle, which carries a man from this sorrowfully earthly existence to the opposite shore. Now, the first, there's 3 ways to do it, basically. Either you hear it and you comprehend his teaching, and then you contemplate and get there. And then you can either be the Buddha, and the third way, this is what the Mahayanas think they're doing right, and this is a quote from Do Murin. He says, "The third vehicle, that of the Bodhisattva, is far superior than the 2 preceding ones. It alone is great, and assures all sentient beings of perfect salvation. With the highest authority of the Mahayana Sutras disclose the absolute perfection of the Bodhisattva ideal." And let me find the second quote here. And yeah, so this Bodhisattva, basically, here we go. I'm going to read another thing. So a Bodhisattva is anybody. So Mahayana doctrine is perfectly developed religiously and philosophically, with the Bodhisattva ideal at its center. The term Bodhisattva signifies 2 things. First, being attached to enlightenment, and being of enlightenment, and then, so you're perfectly enlightened. So this is somebody who made it. Remember one of those monks? This is any kind of monk or person who found enlightenment. So they're perfectly enlightened and in possession of the omniscience of a Buddha. Not the Buddha, a Buddha. So anybody who finds enlightenment now is a Buddha, a singular. And then, this is how you become a Bodhisattva. So you're a monk or anyone who finds this enlightenment. You find Buddhist enlightenment. But you forgo your final interests into nirvana in order to aid sentient beings on their path to enlightenment. Why? Well, for indeed all beings participate in the Buddha nature and can achieve total enlightenment. The Bodhisattva ideal receives its significance from the basic Mahayanist doctrine of innate Buddha nature of all things. So, basically, a Bodhisattva is a monk or a god or a Buddha who makes it all the way to paradise. And then once he enters nirvana, he can see nirvana. He's there. He then turns around and tries to save all of humanity. That's what is bodhisattva. So, short word for it, right? In the Western dialect, you'd say grace. Basically, through bodhisattva, regular non-great monks, or, bodhisattvas, we can receive their grace, and then you can make it the first time. This is the kind of goal of how you do it. Let's see, anything else I want to say here? 23, I got that, and 20... Okay, any questions while I poke around my book? There's one quote I might read, and then we'll move on. But any questions about bodhisattva? And then we're going to go into the 10 perfect virtues on literally the next slide. So if you're curious about those, that's how you become one. So we get the creation process. Alright, I see at least one person typing, and let's see in the chat. Okay, here we go. We got some things here. Oh, I gotta probably do some chat things. Okay, I got some good questions here. First one, Theravada Buddhism, would women then be banned from becoming monks? Yes, there is no woman monks. How do I ban people? Let's see... Oh, he's just posting random crap. I'll ban him later. It's fine. Alright, so could women be banned from becoming monks? So originally there were women monks, and then there stopped being women monks. Nah, I don't care that much, man. Just, whatever. And, yeah, if you don't care, you can leave. That's fine. Part of the public. So somebody says, what's the difference between 6 perfections and the 10 virtues of the Bodhisattva? Or is there a difference? We'll get into those. And can we re-explain the Bodhisattva ideals? Okay. So, first one. The Bodhisattva ideals are basically... we'll get into, they're in the 10 perfect virtues, but the ideal here is, why it's good, is they're the ones who get to enlightenment, and then they aid you to get there. That's what we're looking for. And we'll get into the perfections and such on the next slide. But imagine, like, in a Western conception, this would be almost something like, imagine like a Jesus story, right? Somebody who intercedes for you to get to salvation, but there's a lot of them. That's the biggest differences between Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism, really. So that interaction is what a bodhisattva is. He's giving you grace, and you basically get it through believing. That's the Buddhist answer, strictly speaking. Alright, so let's get into those perfections, and this will make some sense. Alright. And these two are a little bit more elaborate than you'll find in Morgan. That's fine. I basically am taking it from a specialized book on this. So, let's get into the 10 perfect virtues. Okay, so... And these may not, you might be like, Professor, these don't sound very clear. Yeah, that's true. They're not always strictly clear, but let me explain what they say, get you there. So I'm going to read them first, and they're already on the screen if you're curious. So giving, morality, patience, energy, meditation are directed toward the 6th, which is wisdom, as the goal and fruit of all endeavor. So these are the first 6, right? Yeah, and with wisdom. So, and they lead to wisdom, which is intuitive wisdom. So, again, these ones you kind of have to get into what they all mean, but how do we know that? Well, we basically look back. Some of them are self-explanatory, right, like patience or meditation. But how do we understand these? We go back to the Noble Truths, right? We go the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And that's how we can kind of work our way through what all these mean. So, how do you become a bodhisattva? You be a good Buddhist, right? And then you get to wisdom. However, once you get to wisdom, this is basically the goal and fruit of all endeavor. Later, the 4 further perfect virtues were added. So those are the 6 original, and then you add some perfect ones. So, for example, and again, the goal is excellence of knowledge. So we'll get to the later 4. So then we get to the excellence of knowledge. So we first start with intuitive knowledge, then we get to excellent knowledge. All right. And then, evidently, this scheme of virtues, the intellectual proficiencies occupy key positions. It's just something to point out. So with and this is one reason, like, why do Buddhists have such an emphasis on reading, right? Well, this is why. So, okay, next. I'm going to just quote from this book, because I couldn't say it better myself. With practice of these perfections, the Bodhisattva in the 7th stage has entered the ocean of omniscience. And remember, we're talking about, and as he strides on, in his comprehension of the emptiness and unbornness of all things to the 10th stage, where he achieves all forms of contemplation. Seated on a vast lotus, he possesses the concentration called the knowledge of the omniscient one. The sutra describes the magnificent scene of his consecration, in which he becomes manifest as the fully enlightened Buddha. But great compassion compels him to descend by skillful means from heaven to earth without entering nirvana. He sets out to save all sentient things. So, basically, by getting here, right, you understand that you see like the emptiness and unbornness of all things, and you have pity, and then you become a Buddha. So a Bodhisattva is a Buddha. That's what it is. However, they have compassion. So instead of going away and disappearing like the original Buddha, they stay and help people out. And then we get to some of this is where you get, I would call it Buddhist logic. This is a logic class, so it's interesting to think about this. Like, is there logic here? Yes. But in Buddhism, there's a heavy emphasis on what, again, you would say, void and emptiness. Now, why would I pick void and emptiness? What does this matter? Well, basically the way Buddhists explain it from their perspective is kind of like that other world's reality is so beyond our comprehension that any explanation of it is doing a disservice. So instead of explaining it, they don't explain it, right? So it becomes a void, but that void itself is kind of us surrendering to these guys to help us out and to get there. So like this world's knowledge distracts us from that world's knowledge. That's kind of the idea. All right. Next one. The middle state. This is what it's called pranja. I've skipped a lot of the Sanskrit terms, but I'll give you this one because I don't have another way to say it. So the dialectics of pranja. This is what is the half in, half out. So this is basically, imagine trying to comprehend that you see an infinite reality and this limited reality, and you have to somehow comprehend both and help. That's where these bodhisattva are. Basically, we'll think about it like they're holding the door open for us. And somebody asked, and it's a good time to answer this question, is there multiple Buddhas or is there head Buddha? So basically, Mahayanans think Buddha, the original human, became the absolute. So all Buddhas are the Buddha, but there's multiple Buddhas here, and we'll talk about the specifics. So for example, I can give you an example now. Where Mahayana Buddhists went, they turned traditional gods into bodhisattvas. Like, bodhisattva could be your traditional god. So for example, if you've ever seen like the Chinese, the super chubby Buddha, who's the Buddha of like profit and wealth, that's actually originally a Chinese god of God and wealth that became then also a bodhisattva. Same thing happened in Japan. Like there's Japanese gods of war that are also Buddhist bodhisattvas. So there's this ability to become very syncretic with the societies you go to. That's a good question. All right. And another point here, right? This illuminative knowledge and compassion are basically contradictory and insoluble. Like, Buddhists don't actually say, like, I can explain how, like, understanding all reality and having compassion work. You just have to do it. It's very experiential. So it's not strictly something we can understand as unenlightened humans. And somebody says, isn't the fat Buddha considered the happy traveler? He probably is, but I've also heard it explained as, like, you know, you put him in your store in the way that you have, like, oh, he's for good luck and enhancing your business, which feels weird from a Buddhist perspective, but again, we'll talk about how that works out in a little bit. Now, a couple things I don't want to skip. Oh, I'm talking about Buddhist logic, right? I don't want to skip this. And we'll get into it more when we get into Zen Buddhism, and I think next week we'll talk about it a little bit. But there's something called the psychology of the bodhisattva, which is one of the more interesting things. These are basically things that try to explain how these contradictions work. I'm going to give you a couple of these. For example, a bodhisattva holds a spade in his hands, yet the tilling of the ground is done by him empty-handed. Or another one, he is riding on the back of a horse, yet there is no rider in the saddle and no horse under it. Or another one, he passes over the bridge, and it is not the water that flows, but the bridge. So this is an interconnection between eliminative knowledge and compassion. So we can't explain it logically. They're basically unsolved riddles you're supposed to meditate on. For example, another one. It is again like shooting one arrow after another into the air by a man whose mastery of archery has attained a very high degree. He is able to keep all the arrows in the air, making each arrow support the one immediately preceding it. He does this as long as he wishes. So, and again, this is that connection, right? Like, it might not actually make full logical sense, but that's the point of its system of logic. And earlier in class I mentioned this is why you don't really have a thing like, how can I say it, like Buddhists were big into learning, but you don't nowadays have like a lot of Buddhist universities. They exist in Japan, I actually looked them up. But Buddhist like ontology or epistemology is harder because you're not really worried with like understanding how disease viral function works as much as you're worried about like how do I reach enlightenment. So they just have a different focus. There are educational things, but the focus tends to go a different direction. Although I wouldn't say quite it's illogical, but bodhisattva are insoluble to us. Alright, now interestingly there's an oath here, which we're going to read, because apparently a lot of Buddhists like this, especially Zen Buddhists. But this is kind of gives you their mission statement. So first, however innumerable the sentient beings, I vow to save them all. However inexhaustible the passions, I vow to extinguish them all. However immeasurable the dharmas, I vow to master them all. However incomparable the truth of the Buddha, I vow to attain it. Ooh. So, again, this brings back a lot of the principles we studied before, right? So, Mahayana, you vow to save all the beings. Next, the passions, right? The passions will make us suffer, if you remember the Four Noble Truths, right? So I vow to extinguish them all. And then the dharmas was a course in life. So I vow to master them all, understand all the courses of all the lives. And then, however incomparable the truth of the Buddha, I vow to attain it. This goal for knowledge, which again, is one of those foundational pillars of both types of Buddhism. Alright, and any questions about this so far? If you don't understand all of it perfectly, it's okay, but that's what questions are for. I swear streaming makes me 3 times as thirsty as teaching in class. And don't worry too much about random people we get showing up. Okay, Dharma, going back, that's a good question. What is Dharma? That's going back to the original metaphysics. And if you have your Morgan, this is where owning Morgan is great. If you don't own Morgan now, you might have to find a slightly more interesting copy, because I don't know if you can get stuff shipped anymore. You might be able to. So here we go. Dharma is what Buddhists follow. This is quoting 122 in Morgan. Although impossible to translate to English, it's like truth or order or path or righteousness. It's the principle that upholds the universe. It's the purpose for which every single person is born. So it's like your purpose and truth and like the course of your life all mixed together. Again, because you're Buddhist, it's almost allowed to be insoluble. Like, so it doesn't have to be exactly. Oh, are we still going to have to show you my reading notes? That's a good question. I think that one is probably a wash. I'll probably grade, like, if you do them typed, I guess you could show me or take a picture of some of them. That might work. I haven't decided what to do with those yet. But if you're asking questions in class, that's a good thing. If I don't know who you are in Twitch, maybe just tell me your handles. I only have to learn a couple of them. So asking questions is, I would say, we'll say it's comparable to doing reading questions. And we'll probably also have some discussion sections once we figure out all the mic problems. Man, good random questions. Alright, so let's get into Buddhology a little bit. This one's really interesting. So Morgan pretends this doesn't exist, but thankfully we have this wonderful Jesuit we're reading from. He doesn't skip it, which is nice. So Mahayana and Buddhology, another way he says it, not me, I'm not that clever, he calls it cosmotheology. So theology of the cosmos itself, right? So all of like reality out there. So what is this? Well, a couple steps here. Let me find this. So I have on the screen, right, I have the Buddha becomes the absolute. This is why I already kind of explained it, but I'll re-explain it. So this is basically an evolution of Buddhist dogma, right? So we talked about how somebody asked if Theravada is like the original. Yes, because this evolution happened over a couple thousand years. So here we go. So Buddhism draws no boundary between man and God. The divine beings who appear in sutras, in cult, and in art stem mostly from mythology and are classified as sentient beings who move in the birth and death cycles. The elevation of the Buddha to the superhuman realm takes on significance when it gives rise to metaphysical speculations about the Absolute. Emerging originally from the multitude of errant beings in need of salvation, the Buddha transcends the boundary, so definitely as belonging to absolute reality. He ceases to belong to the merely human. His earthly origin, though not forgotten, is nonetheless reduced as insignificant in the phase of the endless history of the acts of grace. Essentially, he is the Absolute. So the Buddha becomes absolute reality, the original Buddha, and then thereby opening this path, basically. Now, there is technically in their theology what they call 3 Buddha bodies. Now, I'm going to say these, I promise. Okay, I almost promise. Wait, I'm not going to ask you what are the 3 Buddha bodies on the test. The test will be more broad than that. But it's good to know what they are, because they are a thing in Buddhist theology. So here they are. I'll say what they are. So, first, there's the transformation body, this is the complete manifestation of the perfect one, Shakyamuni, who is the Buddha, and also partial manifestations, great Buddhist teachers. The second one is what's called the body of enjoyment, the idealized figure of the Buddha, which invite personification. So when a Bodhisattva copies him. Finally, the cosmic body of the Dharma, which is none other than the ultimate reality of Buddhahood itself. So basically, they open up theology that there's like more than one kind of Buddha, and in practice, this leads to unlimited Buddhas. So there's this unlimited number of actual Buddhas in practice now, because they might be the perfect Buddha himself, or copies, or manifestations of him. So basically any domestic god can basically do this, or famous Buddhist monk or saint. And then now we get this kind of unity of a single Buddhist nature. So basically what unifies all these people is Buddha has this Unitarian focus where all of these specifics become one in the Buddha. So now all of a sudden there is this kind of theological explanation where all these different things are just aspects of the same thing. And then this leads to probably the hardest part for me to teach, but I'll do my best. It's called the concept of double truth. Let me find this. Okay, here we go. I'm going to read this paragraph. The superiority of Mahayana to Theravada derives chiefly from the teaching of a mystic, monistic vision which promotes to satisfy, to a large extent, the fundamental yearning of human spirit for unity. So Mahayana focuses on the unity of humanity. So this concept has 2 parts. The concept is a double truth. One, exoteric, involves the plurality of all things. The other is esoteric, in which all and nothing coincide, permeates the whole of Indian thought, and is especially pronounced in Mahayana. So, exoteric is the thing we can observe outside, right? Which is the plurality of all things. All things are kind of similar. The esoteric means like secret, but it's all and nothing coincide. So it's this idea that these 2 things are together. Now, what's the problem? This problem is most advanced in dialects of different radical Buddhism, but and this is to quote the book, Buddhist philosophy gets close to the borders of nihilism, where just nothing matters, right? If everything's everything and everything's nothing, and all of us are the same and different, then suddenly we're nihilists, right? So nothing matters. However, this author says significantly this is saved from the conclusion, not by philosophical speculation, but through mystical intuition alone. Here lies the difference from the genuine philosophical position of Shankara. Philosophy rejoins Buddhist mystics as the way of salvation. So basically grace of the Bodhisattva saved this from being just nihilistic and depressing. And then this is where we get back to mysticism and basically a focus on meditation. So this kind of brings us full circle back around to where we started, where we have these weird contradictory truths in Buddhology, or their theology, right? Which could almost be nihilistic and depressing, but it actually flips around on itself and kind of it's saved by that grace of the Bodhisattva. And without that this would be really depressing, I'm going to be honest. All right, and let's see, we got some questions here. What are the 3 bodies again? Oh, and somebody typed them out. Transformation body, body of enjoyment, cosmic body of the Dharma. And practically what do those mean? The transformation body, to remind you, is the specific, it's distinguished complete manifestation of the perfect Buddha himself, and partial manifestations, which is great Buddhist teachers. So there's basically two. Hi, Jericho. Yeah, I'll make a list of everybody. Yeah, I'll make a list of everybody's participation names, or even better, just post your. If you made comments in the stream, just post that name in the Discord, and then it'll link up to your name, and I'll find it after class. So yeah, so the first body is both the Buddha, the man, right, and in Japanese they call him Shakyamuni, and then partial manifestations, so aka great Buddhist priests. That's the first one. The second one is idealized figure of the Buddha, which is basically all the God copies. And we talk about like Amida Buddha, which is, we'll talk about her next week, I promise. But it's the idea that the second type, which is enjoyment, it's all the different gods and spiritual creatures that get sucked into the pantheon. And then the cosmic body of Dharma is the absolute itself, the ultimate reality of Buddhism itself. Now you're like, but doesn't that list the Buddha twice? Yes. Does that make sense? Good question. In the sense that he transcended and became the absolute reality, then yes. I got you, Jose. You're here. Great. All right. Time. How long have I been going? 40 minutes. Okay, I'm going to do one more slide. Just, what did I call this one? I called this one's philosophical perspective. Basically, how would somebody like a Russell from the outside the tradition look at it? And that one is more contemplative and interesting. Oh, thank you. Yep, great. So if you post your Twitch name in the section chat, I'll make a note of it, and you can get your asking me questions credit. Okay, somebody asked, I'm still confused on the cosmic body of the Dharma. Yep, I figured that one out. Let's see. So the cosmic body of the Dharma, I'll quote it, then explain it. This is none other than the ultimate reality of Buddhahood itself. So basically imagine that behind physical reality, there's this cosmic reality, right? And that cosmic reality is like Buddha-ness, like when you become a Buddha and you're free of reality completely. So Dharma is like your proper course in life or the truth. So that means the dharmic cosmic reality is when you finally get to absolute, the way and how, and then when you get to absolute cosmic reality, that's Dharma. I would say a good translation for us, Dharma is kind of like the Tao. We did Taoism, right, and Confucianism. It's the way to do a thing correctly. That's what the Dharma is, if that makes sense. So it's the correct way to do things. So it's almost like saying the cosmic body of the Dharma is when you finally become one with that absolute, you've found the true, correct way to live in reality. Thank you for the clarification, folks. I'll go through and write it in my notebook after. But this saves forever, so we're pretty good. All right, so really quick, I might... let's see if I want to. Negative. Nope. Yes. I'm just going to check how much is on my next slide and if I want to do it today. Let's see, we did that. We did this. Sure, these are just a couple reflections. I'll call it philosophical perspective. Kind of like, how would a secular philosopher look at this? And that's not even me. Just if we were going to like channel Russell, what kind of image would we get here? All right. So first, Russell might say something like this. There is no internal consistency, so it's a weak philosophy. Now, Morgan immediately would probably say, this is a Western conception, and even I may say, this is just like a philosophical perspective that just doesn't take mystical things seriously. Now, I'm going to point this out. Just because we could say Russell can critique it as a philosophy, it does not mean it's not an effective mystical religion. It just means it's not as applicable as a philosophical system for like how should I analyze science, for example. There is still a way to do it as a Buddhist, by the way, but it's more challenging. I will say the lack of an intellectual tradition compared to the Greek and Chinese rational practices. But again, there is still an intellectual tradition. It's hundreds of thousands of books have been written on Mahayana Buddhism over the years, and there's so many sutras and commentaries, so there is a vast intellectual tradition. I probably should have said like a secular intellectual tradition, but even then, there's definitely there. And I would say, also compared to Christian and Muslim scholarly pursuits, Buddhists tend to focus much more on the mystical and the salvation, and that focus on the spiritual tradition is very important. And of course, we're using intellectual philosophy in university, so that tends to bias us a bit more towards that as the correct answer. Doesn't mean it is, but I'm pointing out that's where it definitely biases us towards. Somebody asked the good going back question. So looking back at the three bodies of transformation body, the perfect one and the body of enjoyment is personification. Yes, kind of. The transformation body is both literally the guy who was the Buddha in real life and teachers. So the transformation body is where you start, right? Where you start as the Buddha as a human or as a human teacher, right? And then you become a Buddha later. And then the body of enjoyment is the personification. So it's that Buddha-ness, mostly in mystical beings. So they become when something becomes a bodhisattva, basically, it's that personification body. That is a good question. All right, so that is, I'm going to go to my conclusion slide. Let's see, we're going to do discussion next time. So our conclusion slide's here. So it's a fun little shrine I found. All right. So this is the end of the stream. We have about 15 minutes left hypothetically, so I can answer verbal questions, or we'll talk about the test a little bit too in the Discord. If you're just a random person or rewatching this later, thank you for watching. It's about a 45-minute video, I think. If you're one of the students and have questions or problems, please contact me. If you're a random person, I guess you could Twitch message me, but I might not get back to you until I'm not busy. But yeah, thanks all for watching. Thanks a lot.